You have some unpublished as yet work on the NHANES data.
Hmm.
Can you, if possible, touch on some of the relationships that you found between body composition, strength, activity, and cognition?
Absolutely. One thing that we've seen in a few population studies recently is that muscle mass is associated with cognitive function, particularly those with low muscle mass or sarcopenia are at risk of accelerated cognitive decline or worse cognitive function at a given moment in time. And we wanted to kind of dig into this a little bit more because I, I think there's an important potential area of trying to disentangle all the various things that go into that. Because if you have low muscle mass, that's probably also associated with lower physical activity. It might be associated with other aspects of body composition, maybe higher or lower body fat could come along with that, and then that can have independent effects. And then there are also components that we know are important for cognition that weren't always taken into account in previous studies. So we talked about B vitamin status, elevated homocysteine is a risk factor, elevated CRP is, in terms of inflammation is a risk factor. We know that hypertension, high blood pressure, high blood sugar, those are risk factors. So we took a couple of years of NHANES where they had all the things that I was interested in looking at. And that included sort of reported levels of physical activity. So whether they did resistance training, their level of sort of daily physical activity in and around their work, whether they did vigorous physical activities. Then there was also a measure of muscle function. So they did an isometric leg extension. So we knew how strong they were. Also, there were DEXA scans, so you had an idea of body composition, and then blood tests and blood pressure tests to account for all the other things. One of the most interesting things that jumped out here was that muscle mass wasn't really related to cognitive function at all. So there was a cognitive function test in NHANES called the DSST, the Digit Symbol Substitution Test. And they, unlike in other studies, muscle mass didn't seem to be related to that at all. And at the same time, basically, whatever kind of physical activity you did, it had an independent effect or benefit in terms of cognitive function. So whether it was resistance training or just high levels of daily physical activity. And then there was also an independent effect of strength. So the stronger your legs were, that was associated with improved cognitive function. And then all the other things that we talked about as well: homocysteine, blood pressure, blood sugar. Those are all significantly associated with worse cognitive function at a given point in time. And these are individuals in their 60s on average. When you look at muscle mass, because I was particularly interested in whether muscle mass has an independent effect on the brain. Can I just tell everybody to get super jacked and they're gonna have smarter brains because of it? What we found, and we've seen this in a few different settings now, is that physical activity and muscle mass weren't really correlated at all. So there's this idea that muscle mass is associated, more muscle mass is associated with improved mortality or decreased mortality risk, decreased chronic disease risk, cardiovascular disease risk. However, at the population level, people are not gaining muscle mass because they're going to the gym. They're gaining muscle mass because they're gaining more total mass. And that muscle isn't having the same effect as those who are, gaining muscle mass because of direct physical activity or resistance training. And that's something that I don't think anybody's really noticed before at the population level. I think it's important because if we say muscle mass is protective from X, it probably matters how you gain that muscle in the first place. And that's also going to be related to how functional or strong that muscle is. And so in our population study, muscle mass wasn't associated with cognitive function at all, but it also wasn't associated with physical activity. Those who did more physical activity didn't have more muscle mass in that setting. So it kind of brings up more questions than answers, but I think it's interesting when you try and disentangle how all these different things then affect the brain and long-term health.
And you mentioned that they looked at knee extension torque. Presumably, you then looked at whether knee extension torque relative to body mass as a proxy of relative strength is associated with cognition based on what you just said.
Yeah, exactly. So that was kind of the final step, was we wondered whether relative strength, so how strong are you relative to the amount of muscle you have? Does that predict cognition? And in this group, it did. So for a given amount of muscle mass, how functional is that muscle? That seems to be associated with improved cognitive function. And there are multiple reasons why that might be the case. It could be that those muscles are muscles that have been stimulated with regular physical activity, and the physical activity is associated with improved cognitive function. Or, part of it may be that you have better neuromuscular function, right? The brain is better at stimulating the function of the muscle tissue, and then that's also associated with improved cognitive function, because you have, that in itself is a better connection and stimulus.
It's a tricky one because there are so many determinants of relative strength. You've got
Yeah.
everything from muscle tendon unit architecture to myosin heavy chain composition and so on. So more research is needed, as always. I
Yeah.
was just
And
wondering, Tommy, what do you
yeah, I was just
go
going to
for it?
say that that's absolutely true. You try and quantify how well a muscle functions. All those things become important. So ideally, if you do this at a population level, and my interest is more in terms of how can we better understand these important risk factors at a population level to maybe help people navigate some of this stuff. Once you have a big enough population, hopefully some of those other structural, biochemical, genetic factors kind of get washed out a little bit if you have enough people, so that you can see some of these broader trends and associations. But of course, like somebody's genetics is and their fiber type and their physical structure in terms of where their tendons insert and attach, in terms of how well they can move a leg extension, all of that does become important in terms of measuring function.
You've touched on some of the potential mechanisms, but what do you think are some of the ways by which exercise may improve cognitive function? So you mentioned things like cardiovascular function and certain trophic factors, but what do you think some of the key ones are?
I probably think about them at two different, or maybe all three buckets that we talked about. So if I talked about this supply bucket, getting things to the brain that are important to make the brain, and then there's the stimulus bucket, and then there's the support bucket. And I think exercise can tackle all of those in different ways. So the vascular supply, I think, is worth mentioning again, because when a certain area of the brain is active, there's this process called neurovascular coupling, where the activity increases the supply of blood flow and oxygen to that area of the brain. And in order for that to work, for that to happen, you need a healthy vascular system. So that's where I think things like aerobic activity become particularly important. But then also the other cardiovascular risk factors, um, you know, lipids, blood pressure, that kind of stuff is important as well. Then, in some respects, this is direct neuromuscular stimulus, and I think that's the case both with weight training, sort of basic resistance training, but also, particularly those complex open skill type movements, dancing, badminton, all that kind of stuff. The ball sports or board sports. And then there's the support aspect, and avoiding toxic exposures to some respect. So one thing that I think is important is that our skeletal muscle is our biggest glucose sink, and we know that blood sugar regulation is an important risk factor for cognitive decline. So there was um, there's the big English longitudinal aging study where they looked at individuals who had different levels of blood sugar control. So they had those that had normal blood sugar control, those who were pre-diabetic, and those who were type 2 diabetic. And the worse their blood sugar control, the faster their decline in cognitive function. So we know that exercise is protective against pre-diabetes and diabetes, at least partly because it creates this sink of blood sugar that helps you both acutely and chronically regulate your blood sugar. So that's one aspect. Then another aspect, which I think we're still just really getting into as a research field, is the idea of myokines or exerkines. I wasn't a big fan of the word exerkines, but kind of it's now becoming increasingly used, so I kind of have to accept it.
Scientists love certain prefixes and suffixes, like
Yeah,
chronobiologists love sticking chron on everything, and people love sticking kines on everything: hepatokines, myokines, baptokines. The list goes
adipokines.
on.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
just like omics, right? So now we talk about the exposome as well as your genome and your metabolome and your proteome. Yeah, we love it. So the reason why it's important, the distinction between, say, myokines and exerkines, is that myokines are specifically released by the muscle tissue, whereas exerkines are these big class of things that are released by tissues, multiple tissues in the body, in response to exercise. So that includes the adipose tissue, adipokines, and hepatokines from the liver, and myokines from the muscle. And what you see is that there are several things that get released, and probably some of which we're still discovering and we don't even know about yet. We've heard about MOTS-c, LAC-Phe, irisin. All these things have just been, discovered over the last few years, and each of them had a fancy paper in Nature or Science, and was this molecule that gets released with exercise that improves either cardiovascular function or decreases mortality risk or improves cognitive function or improves brain structure. So these things that get released are going to be critically important, and that includes things like brain-derived neurotrophic factor. We know it's a trophic factor for the brain, but then also um, there's effects of an acute inflammatory response from myokines. So like IL-6 gets released as a myokine during exercise, and if you acutely measure some things after exercise, you see this initial inflammatory response, but then afterwards that results in decreased sort of chronic inflammation. So we're decreasing another risk factor there by modulating it with exercise. So I think depending on the type of exercise and where you look in the chain, probably one of the reasons why physical activity is so important is that it's tackling all of your buckets of things that are important for brain health.
I wonder about the myokines and the exerkines. I can't help but feel a little bit skeptical in the light of some things that have happened previously. So I first came across these during my master's. One of the professors in the department at the time had just studied a paper, just published a paper on irisin, suggesting that it wasn't an exercise regulated
Mm,
gene. After I think Bruce Spiegelman discovered it, and that, as you say, has been this slew of them that have come to light in recent years. But the parallel that I'm tempted to draw is with the hormone hypothesis of people's responses to strength training. Lots of people
mm,
used to think you do strength training and you have this surge in testosterone and growth hormone in response to that, and maybe those somewhat forecast the types of adaptations that you're going to get. That didn't come to fruition. However, I think that we've come to realize that those acute changes in endocrine signaling probably do have some effects, but just not the ones that people were most interested in. So, in that instance, maybe the growth hormone, for example, and the change in energy metabolism led to greater time spent in slow wave sleep and
mm.
more slow wave activity during that stage of sleep, which is in many ways restorative. So I just wonder about whether we will find out that some of these things are having some positive effects on human health, but maybe the ways by which they're doing so differ from the ones that are currently speculated.
I'm sure that's going to be the case. And I remember everybody being excited about irisin, and then reading some of the subsequent work and thinking, that's probably not the silver bullet that people thought it might be. You could give it exogenously and activate all these things. And I don't think there's anything from exercise that's going to fall into that category. So because there's also going to be questions of, do these things cross the blood-brain barrier? Can they actually affect the brain directly, or are they having some um, peripheral effect? Of course, one of the main benefits of physical activity is improved sleep. Is that one of the ways? I didn't mention that as one of the ways why it might support brain health long term. So yes, my guess is some of them aren't affecting the brain. It's just correlations, and some of them are beneficial in ways that we don't yet understand or expect.
Do you think it's worthwhile thinking about this in terms of the so called discordance hypothesis? You mentioned earlier these inherently human behaviors.
Mm,
And when we think about, say, pre industrial people and the types of activities they did, many of them were group based. They probably spent a lot of time dancing. they probably spent a lot of time hunting and foraging when they were very focused and they needed to do things like navigate their ways through forests, etc. So, do you think that's a useful heuristic, a way of thinking about the types of exercise that are most likely to boost brain health?
Yes, I think so, and I do believe in this idea that the body expects, for want of a better word, certain types of inputs in order to maintain function. And there are some nice correlates of things that have been written previously. So, Inigo San Milan recently had a review paper where there's this quote where he basically says that physical inactivity is so common that we now think of physical activity as an intervention rather than something that actually we used to do all day, every day. It was part of our, it was just part of surviving. And Charles Brenner wrote something similarly in a paper that said that you know uh, caloric overconsumption is now so common that we think of caloric restriction as an intervention rather than, well, actually, sometimes food just wasn't particularly available, and we were sort of regulated in terms of our intake because of the environment. And I think cognitive demand and cognitive stimulus are very similar. There are some, we used to have these complex cognitively activating interactions with our environment and other people that were just like baked into daily life, right? You live in a tribe and you're constantly interacting with others and requiring to do these complex navigations and things like you mentioned. Or as you get older, you have a teaching role, and we know that there's some evidence that teaching is cognitively stimulating in a similar way, right? You're then passing on stories or experience, and we don't do that in the same way anymore. So I think there is some benefit from thinking about, how did these activities look historically, as part of, small, closer knit tribes, a few thousands of years ago, and some of which, still exist today to some respect. Um, and how does it look now, and what's different? I think, physical activity, nutrition, cognitive stimulus, and those kinds of activities, I think they fit into that category. And you're right, the types of physical activity we used to do were inherently social, um, because they were either done for, like dancing for joyful or religious or other reasons, or they were hunting, tracking, navigating, in order to forage for food or something like that. And they all included a complex motor component, a physical activity component, and a social component.
To other things, a lot of that was probably taking place in nature, and there are probably some
Yeah.
additional health benefits to be had from exercising in nature. And then finally, sex is good for you. So that's probably another one to throw in the bucket.
We don't have sex in the model currently, but I agree it should definitely go in there for multiple reasons. So we'll add that in the next iteration. But you're
I was going to ask, was that a peer review thing or?
we just didn't think about it, which is probably slightly worrying, because physical activity, hormonal stress reduction, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, definitely worth adding in, as is the nature component. And I think that's one area where I didn't mention it earlier, but when you're thinking about how we interact with screens and phones, um, that sort of narrow focus does in some ways activate the sympathetic nervous system, because normally when you're very focused in on something, it's usually associated with triggering the fight or flight response. When you really need to look at something, historically maybe it's a potential danger or something you need to be aware of, and so the body is almost primed in some way, when you foveate on something like that, to have that kind of response. Whereas when you're out in nature, you have this more sort of like widened peripheral vision, and that's one of the reasons why things like forest bathing and walks outdoors seem to be associated with a decrease in the stress response. Um, so yeah, I mean, that's us studying it in sort of like the modern scientific setting. But of course, there are going to be a whole bunch of other reasons and ways that being out in nature and physical activity out in nature are going to be beneficial in that way.
And also, if you spend too much time indoors in dark rooms looking at screens close to you, then you're going to end up myopic. And then, like me, you're going to have to spend 6 grand on laser eye surgery. So get outside.
And it's going to affect your chronobiology because of the timing and type of your light exposure.
Very well said, Tommy. Okay, so lots of scientists and other people are interested in measuring cognitive load. And to do so, some will use questionnaires, so things like the NASA Task Load Index. Other people will look at measures such as eye movements. And if your model holds up, which I think it does, and sufficient levels of different types of cognitively demanding stimuli are important to brain health, do you have any thoughts on ways to analyze the load of such activities in a way that permits comparisons across different types of activities?
That's a really great question. And the main reason being that in order to substantiate a model, and what we have is currently it's a model. I think we previously called it a theory, but the peer reviewers didn't like that. Um, so we called it a model. And in order to either substantiate or refute it, you need to be able to test it, and that is quite difficult to do because of the of what you say. Like, how do you compare all these different things from a cognitive load standpoint? One thing that I think we need to appreciate is that subjective cognitive load and a beneficial cognitive stimulus are not exactly the same thing. So if you're thinking about somebody who feels very busy during the day, they're like, well, I'm constantly being cognitively stimulated because I'm doing all these things all day. I don't think that's the same thing. I liken it to, again, if we go back to exercise, there's this idea of this, the gray zone of training, where if you spend a bunch of time around, say, lactate threshold, pushing yourself really, really hard, that's the type of training that's the most difficult physically, but it's in this gray zone of adaptation. It's not low level enough to stimulate things like new blood vessels and things like that that support the structure of the muscle, and it's not intense enough to stimulate, say, mitochondrial adaptations that improve, like VO2 max and things like that. You're kind of in this middle ground, so it feels very hard, but you're not at either end of the things that create specific adaptations. And I think multitasking or feeling busy is that same thing. It feels very demanding, but there's the biggest potential gap between how hard it feels and how much adaptation you're actually stimulating. Um, and my friend James Hewitt, who's talked about this, is like that multitasking being this cognitive middle gear where it feels very hard, but you're actually not stimulating adaptation. So I think some of the ways in which we measure cognitive load do not necessarily measure actual beneficial cognitive stimulus. And when I think about what would constitute that kind of stimulus, I think, again, if we go back to either skill learning or uh, like infant brain development, usually it's something like 30 to 90 minutes. If it's 90 minutes, there's probably some short breaks in there of a concerted effort where you spend time at the edge of your current capabilities. And so, maybe a little bit of failure is important there, because as you fail, you start to release a whole bunch of, noradrenaline and other things that create an environment for plasticity, right? To support a change in the brain. And then after that, you probably can't do it for much longer than that, because it is very cognitively strenuous. And after that, you need a period of rest and recovery. So if you think about a typical class, your language class or music class, you're probably spending 2 or 3 chunks of 15 to 20 minutes, really working hard right at the limits of your capabilities, with some short breaks in between, like a Pomodoro style technique, something like that. And then you're you don't start to adapt or memorize or really cement those skills without some period of sleep or consolidation. And babies are the same, right? They'll spend maybe 15, 20 minutes trying to stand or trying to walk or trying some new language or social skill, and then they're going to sleep a whole bunch. So they start to consolidate what they've learned in that period of time. And that's, when we're thinking about the kind of stimuli that are important for developing cognitive function, I think that's where we need to focus. I don't currently have a good idea of how we quantify that. But I think it's important to dissociate subjective cognitive load from those kind of stimuli that are probably going to have very different effects.
I'll just chime in with a few other comments. So one of them is obviously different brain circuits are involved in different processes. And what you tend to see is that the more that these discrete circuits are used during a given activity, the more slow wave activity you see in those circuits later. And whereas previously people used to think of sleep as largely being a top down phenomenon, some people now think of it as being more bottom up.
Mm.
And so what you see is this kind of local sleep in these small brain regions that then influences adjacent cortical columns. And when a sufficiently large part of the brain shows sleep like activity, someone will enter what we know as being sleep. And we used to think that sleep occurred in these discrete stages where all parts of the brain might be asleep at once. And it's clear that that's not the case, going by some fascinating research recently on people who have epilepsy. You mentioned the Pomodoro technique. That's just 25 minutes on, often with 5 minutes off. I don't know how watertight the research on that is, but I think it's a really helpful way to go. And you can just set a timer on your phone if you want to give that a go. One of
It's
the things
not
that
yeah, I mean, like Pomodoro is I don't think there's any like really well research specific approach, but most, if you look across that, there was a desk time study which looked at how, the most productive people, what period of time, like how much are they doing focused work versus then rest in between, and then in that it's more like 30 to 40 minutes with a 10 or 12-minute break in between. And then there are studies on like professional musicians in terms of how much time they spend in concerted practice versus rest in between, and all of it kind of falls into these buckets of, somewhere between 20 and 40 minutes with short breaks. And then once you've done that 2 or 3 times, you need a longer break. But sort of the exact numbers probably matter a little bit less.
yeah, I completely agree with that. And I've heard many people say recently something to the effect of you should work in 90-minute cycles, which I think emanates from the fact that sleep cycles occur roughly every 90 minutes. It's actually often a little bit longer than that. But the evidence of 90-minute cycles in brain function during the day and then extrapolating that should be used to set how long you're working on discrete tasks is non-existent. And the reality is that we have cycles of activity in the brain across many different timescales, ranging from milliseconds to hours. So I think Tommy's advice is absolutely spot on there. And I was just thinking about how you personally set up your day, Tommy, because you mentioned James Hewitt there, and obviously he does a lot of work with knowledge workers who are trying to
Mm.
be as productive as possible. I know you and Josh recently did a podcast on this subject, and there are lots of different variables that affect cognitive function. So, for example, the longer that you've been doing a given task, the more prone you are to errors. There is your sleep history, there is the time of the biological day. So, early types or morning larks are more likely to do their best work in the biological morning than late types who might find they do their best work late at night. But I was just wondering if you've got any additional thoughts on setting up your day if you have quite a lot of control over how you schedule it, if someone wants to be as productive as possible.
Yeah, I think, from all the lines of research that you mentioned there, including some of, James's work, I think there's definitely there has to be some personalization to this. Again, if you have control over it. And so I myself know that I do my best work in the morning. So I try and keep that clear for things when I'm going to have to use my brain. And that's either, concerted deep work. And often that's statistical analyses and coding and stuff like that, or it might be, you know, having an interesting podcast conversation, as we are right now. Um, that's where, so I try and keep the morning free for that kind of work, because that's when I feel like I do my best work. And then sort of more tedious, repetitive work, answering emails, doing admin, that kind of stuff, I feel like my my energy sort of dips in the middle of the day a little bit, and so that's when I do that kind of work. And then it sort of increases a little bit, and then I have this period of time, maybe between 2 and 4 p.m., where I can do a little bit more of my deeper concerted work, and then I transition that into when I do my exercise, because that's when I generally feel best during the day from a physical standpoint. So I set up my day based on when I feel good and able to do those certain things. But you're right. Other people, it may be entirely flipped. Like it takes them a long time to feel like they're switched on, so they should do emails and admin stuff in the morning, and then as their subjective um, focus it increases later in the day, then they can start to do some of that more deeper work.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about is your perspective on the pros and cons of continuous glucose monitors. You mentioned earlier the importance of glycemic control to cardiometabolic health and brain function. And you posted something on Instagram about the subject a while ago. And I messaged you off the back of it asking whether we should coin the term orthoglycemia, which, which would be congruent with phenomena such as orthorexia and orthosomnia, basically suggesting that a lot of people, particularly people with strong influence on the perspectives of others on health, have what could be an unhealthy obsession with maintaining very tight blood sugar control. And obviously, glycemic control is very important to many different health outcomes, and it's relevant to risk of diseases such as diabetes, PCOS, etc. But that doesn't mean that everyone needs to wear a continuous glucose monitor. So, when do you think these should be used briefly? And what do you think some of their glaring limitations are?
You're right that. So I think orthoglycemia is a fantastic term that you've coined, and I think that explains a lot of what you and I see in the spheres that we inhabit on social media. And like you say, glycemic, glucose control is incredibly important, both as a risk factor and related to other chronic conditions. And there are studies where they look at glucose variability in particular. I think the best studied metric, or one of the best studied metrics, is MAGE, or mean amplitude of glycemic excursions, like how big are your spikes and how regular are your spikes in blood sugar. And that associates with things like your plaque, your coronary artery plaque burden, which is obviously a big risk factor for cardiovascular disease. It associates with the risk of type 2 diabetes. In those with type 2 diabetes, it's correlated with your cognitive function, and that's also reversible. If you improve your MAGE, you associate with improved cognitive function in that setting. So in the diseased population setting, I think it does have a role to play. And there are some small studies now that show that in type 2 diabetics who are wearing continuous glucose monitors, it improves adherence to a lifestyle-based, like dietary or physical activity intervention. I think that's great, right? It shows people why these things are beneficial, and it helps them adhere to it. At the other end, we have the biohackers and the worried well, who are also really into this stuff. And there's much less evidence for its use there. And one of the major limitations is it's being used as a proxy for something else, probably. So, some people who use continuous glucose monitoring do it because glucose tracks with insulin levels, and they're actually more worried about insulin and chronic hyperinsulinemia being a risk factor again for cardiovascular disease and various other things. But we know there are times when glucose and insulin diverge, like in vigorous physical activity. Glucose goes up, insulin stays the same, or goes down. And we also know, things like when you eat protein, glucose stays flat, but insulin goes up. I'm not worried about the insulin spike associated with eating protein at all. But we know that these things diverge, so it's a poor proxy. It actually can be a poor proxy for the thing that they're thinking about. Sort of beyond that, one thing that I think that's very interesting and that sort of feeds into your idea of orthoglycemia is that you can now physically see somebody filming themselves on Instagram or TikTok as they get worked up about the thing that they're going to eat and how it's going to affect their blood sugar. And I think that stress response is probably more worrisome than the glucose spike itself, especially because these people are probably in pretty great shape to start with. They're in good health to start with, and we know that because they tell us about it. Um, there's a nice study, and we've gotten this far without talking at all about any of Ellen Langer's work, which is which is unusual for me. But Ellen Langer is a psychologist at Harvard who really likes manipulating people's environments. Especially, she loves manipulating clock time. And this comes into your idea of orthosomnia, where she did the study where people are randomized to be told about different lengths of sleep, and what they thought they slept versus how they actually slept was a bigger determinant of their cognitive function the next day. But she did a study with type 2 diabetics where they were randomized to two different milkshakes, and before they took the milkshake, they were shown, here's how many carbs and things are in this milkshake, and then they looked at their blood sugar levels afterwards. And one milkshake had a high sugar content and one milkshake had a low sugar content, and of course the milkshake with the higher sugar content resulted in a bigger glucose spike afterwards, but both these milkshakes were identical. So the expectation, and probably if you're diabetic, you're very acutely aware of your carbohydrate intake. So there's a stress response. Well, this is the hypothesis. There's a stress response associated with the expectation of this big glucose influx and how that's going to, or carbohydrate influx, how that's going to affect your blood sugar. And in response, you get a bigger blood sugar spike. So I think some of what we're seeing in terms of using this in a healthy population is they're expecting a bigger blood sugar spike because this is a bigger carbohydrate load. And then they drive their blood sugar higher because of that expectation. And I think, the stress response you're initiating, which can directly affect your physiology, is probably more important than that single blood sugar spike in response to a meal.
Yeah, definitely check out the work of Ellen Langer and Alia Crum as well. They've done some very entertaining experiments in the last decade or so. I know companies such as Abbott are working on devices to continuously monitor things like ketones and glucose round the clock concurrently. And I've also seen data suggesting that postprandial triglyceridemia better predicts cardiovascular disease risk than fasting triglycerides. So I imagine that would be helpful to monitor the substrate fluxes of several different substrates at the same time, and
Yeah.
maybe some other factors too. Ultimately, that might be things like cytokines. Do you have any thoughts on what it would be helpful to monitor? And then also, just thinking about it, you use the term MAGE there, mean amplitude of glycemic excursions. In the case of lipemia, that would be male, wouldn't it? Mean amplitude of
Yeah.
lipemic.
Or MATE, mean amplitude of triglyceridemic
Yeah.
excursions.
And then make mean amplitude of ketonemic excursions. So we're coining all sorts of terms today.
Yeah, when that appears in the future literature, we would like credit. Thanks very much. I think all of these potential substrates can be very interesting to track, particularly as it relates to insulin, because insulin's main role is to maintain as stable as possible availability of energy in the circulation at any given time. And so these things are in some in most tissues and in some ways are sort of interchangeable, right? Are you using fatty acids as a main energy source, ketone bodies, glucose? And if insulin is working properly, and insulin resistance is, I believe, sort of underlies a large body of our chronic disease burden. If insulin is working properly, then the net energy availability should remain relatively stable. But if you're just looking at one substrate, you're not understanding the interplay between all the potential substrates. And then lactate is potentially another one that comes into play, particularly around and after exercise. So if you want to really understand the system, which is kind of what people are trying to do, then I think you need to, in some way, measure all of those. And then it's either triglycerides or chylomicrons or free fatty acids, some version of circulating fats, ketones, lactate, and glucose. And at least for ketones, lactate, and glucose, people are working on those continuous monitors. Cortisol is another one that people are working on. And so I think that once that exists, once that technology exists, following how these things interact with exercise, eating, sleep, all these kinds of things, I think it's going to be incredibly interesting. It's going to help us really understand, better understand the pathology. Do I think that most people need to do that in order to improve their health? Absolutely not. I don't think that information is necessary at all for most of the interventions that I think can have a big impact. One scenario that I didn't mention, in relation to glucose monitoring, I think if people are interested in it, that's fine. But what I would caution against is using continuous glucose monitors continuously. And the reason for that is we know now, we've increasingly appreciated from a whole bunch of work, like by those such as Erin Segal and Tim Spector, that how you respond to a specific food in terms of your glucose spike is very different from person to person. Like, I think the idea of the glycemic index should probably just be completely deprecated, because two people who are both very healthy can have very different responses to the same carbohydrate containing foods. And it depends on genetics and when you're eating it and whether you've exercised recently and all that kind of stuff, how you slept, all that kind of stuff. However, we are creatures of habit, and so we eat the same foods very frequently. So if you're going to use a continuous glucose monitor, I think if you used it for 10 days or 2 weeks, which is sort of the lifespan of most sensors, you probably have a good idea of how you respond to the majority of the things you eat regularly. So if there's one thing that for whatever reason causes a big blood sugar spike, and that's something that you want to manage, then you know enough information about that one thing, and then maybe you find a replacement. I don't think you need this data or these data continuously. I think you can gather enough in a very short period of time, and then you can make changes accordingly if you want to. Though whether that actually has a big impact on long-term health is still remains to be seen.
Let's transition to some more rapid fire questions, and we're going to start with some hot topics, and then we're going to go into more important stuff. So, starting with the hot topics, when you look at different supplements and drugs that are out there, let's say that they might be purportedly longevity promoting supplements or weight loss drugs, which of them do you think are actually really strong candidates at the population level as brain health promoting agents? Bearing in mind that this is a rapid fire question.
Of the regularly touted longevity supplements and weight loss drugs, none of them.
Okay.
Unless you had a
Next
specific
question.
candidate you wanted to discuss.
No, I was thinking more about, for example, somebody taking a GLP-1 agonist to lose a substantial amount of weight. Let's say that somebody has obesity and concurrently they have severe obstructive sleep apnea, and they take semaglutide, and over the course of a year they lose 18% of their body mass, and as a result their obstructive sleep apnea more or less disappears, and in turn their brain health improves. So it's another instance of something positively affecting an outcome that wouldn't initially necessarily have been of interest to a researcher, but is very relevant to someone's lived experience each day.
Okay, then
Next
I'll change.
question.
No. Can I change my answer then? Because I think
Yeah,
that
sure.
is an important answer. And so we have evidence from the dipeptyl peptidase 4 inhibitors, which act in that same pathway, that you improve blood sugar control and you improve cognitive function in those with type 2 diabetes. So yes, if you're significantly improving glycemic control and obstructive sleep apnea and all these other things, that will decrease your long-term risk of cognitive decline. So yes, good example.
Next question. If I want to be smarter, I should just take smart drugs, right?
No.
Next question. What do you make of the current psychedelic bubble?
I'm very interested in it. Where it will lead us, I don't know, but I think particularly in the right setting with the right indication, there's a lot of potential benefit to come from that.
Probably largely mediated by increases in neuroplasticity. There's a lot that you can do off the back of that.
Yeah.
Next question, photobiomodulation. Are you excited about its potential applications in the context of different types of brain pathologies?
Yes. I think there's nice work by people like Francisco Gonzalez Lima showing that you can directly stimulate the mitochondria with certain wavelengths of red light. And that, in my mind, is essentially an externally applied cognitive stimulus. That's why you're essentially driving additional electrons through the electron transport chain. You're creating demand and flux through that system. And I think there are certain scenarios where that could be beneficial. So yes.
Okay, more important questions. Strongman or powerlifting?
Strongman.
Bristol or Seattle?
Seattle.
Oh,
Not a fair
Tommy.
not a fair comparison, but that's where I intend to spend a large majority of my future years.
Wow, I think you're saying that to please your wife. She won't listen to this, but Borgen or the Bridge?
Borgen.
Favorite baked goods?
Sticky toffee pudding.
Favorite TLA?
TLA.
Favorite YouTube channel?
I I almost never go on YouTube.
I thought you were going to say James Hoffman. I know that you're a
Oh,
coffee
I
connoisseur.
do enjoy, but I watch all this stuff on Instagram.
2 recommended documentaries. Don't have to be about the brain.
Bad Blood. There's one I can't remember the name of. It's about DuPont and all the like the PFAS they dumped into the water system. The Devil We Know is what it's called.
Ah, okay. I think there's a film about the same thing named something like Dark Water or Dark Waters, which is also worth watching. 2 recommended books.
Behave by Robert Sapolsky and The Coddling of the American Mind by
Oh,
Lukianoff and Haidt.
I haven't read the latter. Looking forward to
It's
that.
really good. Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, so just finish with a little bit of speculation. There are lots and lots of podcasts about health, and you've been on many of the better ones. When you look back on these, is there something you either wish you'd been asked about or something that you wish that you'd emphasized more?
I think there's something that I wish I'd emphasized less. Can that be my answer?
Absolutely. What is it?
Optimization. I think historically, 5 or 6 years ago, maybe even more recently than that, I was really focused on optimizing everything: blood tests, sleep, physical activity. And the more time I spend in that space, and like glucose monitoring would have been included, the more time I spend in that arena, the more I realized that you cannot be optimal. And the process of trying to optimize is in itself a significant stressor where I think you're negatively affecting your physiology by constantly thinking, I'm not doing enough, I'm not doing well enough, I'm not good enough at this. What you actually want is resilience so you can perform in suboptimal conditions. And that's where I think like building buffers, into systems, be that cognitive systems, physical systems, that's probably where the money is. And this sort of like hyper focus on being optimal, I think is gone too far, and I contributed to that. And that's something I wish I talked about less.
Briefly, just speaking about resilience in systems, I realize that you might not have used the 2 words cognitive reserve together in this podcast.
Yes.
Do you want to just very briefly mention what that is?
Yes. So that's a good point, and I'm surprised I didn't mention it. But essentially, cognitive reserve is the same as, well, any physiological system can have a difference between what it needs to do every day in its day-to-day functions versus what it's physically capable of. It's the difference between the effort it takes you to sit up, stand up from the toilet versus how much can you maximally squat. Like that's the reserve. As you get older or you enter cognitive decline, that reserve decreases such that you are no longer able to increase function in the context of increased demands. Like you suddenly need to have, to do something cognitively demanding, and you no longer have that capacity in the system. And then you get to a point where your reserve comes down to the level of your day-to-day activities. That's what we would call cognitive frailty, just like physical frailty. You're no longer able to catch yourself when you fall because you can't increase your function when you need it to. And then eventually you sort of go past that point, and that's when you enter significant dementia because your capacity is below what you need in order to do your daily activities. So all the things we talked about today, one of the reasons why they're beneficial is they increase cognitive reserve so that you have more on tap when you need it, like when you get sick or stressed or something like
If you were the global czar of funding into brain related research, as I fully expect you to be in 15 years' time,
that.
what is what are some high level changes that you'd make to funding allocation?
I would not completely, but I would not completely remove, but I would slash funding into basic neuroscientific mechanisms in mouse models, which is where a large majority of our funding currently goes. And I think most of it is a waste of time. I would focus more on high level uh, interventions, either in well-established or newly developed animal models, and or in humans, and how they interact. So some complex, multi-arm randomized trials to look at how nutrient status and toxic exposures and physical activity, affect long-term cognitive function. I think some of that can be done in the lab, some of it needs to be done in humans, but we've spent billions looking at the single function of a single gene in a single cell in a single strain of a single species, and very little of it has translated to humans. And I don't expect that to change as we delve even deeper into those cells.
Where should people follow you online, Tommy?
Instagram at Dr. Tommy Wood is where you'll find most of my stuff. I'll post podcasts when I'm on there, or sometimes like papers that I write that people might find interesting. They end up on there.
And also Better Brain Fitness,
Better Brain Fitness,
plug
yes,
number two.
my new podcast with Dr. Josh Turknet. Um, there's a link to it in the bio of my Instagram, and maybe you'll also link to it in the show notes.
Absolutely. Tommy, thanks so much, mate. Honestly, if I have a health related question and I'm puzzled by it, if I want someone to look at my blood work, it's generally you that I go to for that stuff. So thank you for being so generous with your time and for all that you do, because it is really appreciated.
Well, thanks very much, and likewise, I feel the same about you. So I'm excited about this podcast for you and all the other stuff that you're doing. I follow it intently because I think it's all great stuff.